Okay, here we go. Final video for the day. Going to get us caught up for book 2. Very good. We are right here, kind of in the middle of book 2 now. We've looked at Glaucon's argument for justice and injustice, Adimantus's argument. We've looked at the two cities. That part about the two cities, very important, okay? Which city do you prefer? The boring just city or the exciting unjust city? Interesting. Kind of an interesting irony there, don't you think? That second city, the city of luxury, really does get out of hand quickly, doesn't it? All these extra, unnecessary sorts of things, crafts, products, services, desires, etc., get added. The city balloons in size. It encroaches on the territories of its neighbors. Its neighbors now want to also attack them. We might want to attack our neighbors. Now we need it to sustain a large military. That is a huge expense. That's going to take a lot of resources. Do you think a military is necessary in the previous city? Important little question. But so we've added a military, we've added government. We're going to need a lot of government. And why is that? Well, we're going to make enemies outside of the city. And also there's going to be a lot of internal conflict within our city, right? Let's face it. All these desires running around, trying to grab what it wants, right? That's going to create conflict, right? People trying to grab the same thing, grab what someone else has. Maybe resources might be scarce in a particular area. Not everyone can get what they want. Class is going to develop. Economic class is going to develop in that second luxurious city, right? There'll be those who have a lot and those who don't have near as much. The rich and the poor, right? And so on. A lot of problems develop in that second city. Well, we mentioned government, right? If we're going to need government because we are not governing ourselves and our own personal lives, now we're going to need someone outside of us to govern us and to help govern potential and actual conflicts. We're going to need government officials. We're going to need politicians. We're going to need rulers. Socrates calls them guardians on page 53, right? We're going to need guardians, guarding our city against enemies outside and guarding our city within, all the potential conflicts there. And this is a very important job now, too, a very important craft. Right? Yeah. And so, give me one moment. I'm taking a note. Something just kind of hit me. That happens from time to time. Okay, good. Just want to take a note. Well, so what's the question that really begins this final lecture and video for book 2? It comes at the bottom of page 53, top of 54, where Socrates says at the bottom of 53, then to the degree that the guardian's job is of greatest importance to our city, it requires the most freedom from other things, as well as the greatest craft and practice. These guys are going to have to be really good at their jobs. They're going to have to be good at governing. What kind of knowledge is required for that, right? And then he says at the top of 54, then our task, it seems, is to select, if we can, which sorts of natures suit people to guard the city. Simply put, who is going to be a guardian for us? Who is suitable for that? What sort of nature is best for guarding the city within and without? right? What's the best sort of guardian nature? Who makes the best kind of ruler? Remember back in book 1 when Socrates was talking with Thrasymachus and he asked that question, who makes the better ruler? Someone who desires to rule versus someone who does not desire to rule? And Socrates actually said, it's the latter. It's someone who does not desire to rule. Because people who desire to rule tend to want to dominate others, right? And they want those other rewards and other benefits that people get from ruling. Having influence over others, having a great reputation, being looked upon highly as someone who's extra important, having power over others, wealth, prestige, fame, recognition. The people who desire to rule, deep down, secretly, that's what they really want. Whereas those who do not desire to rule, but do so anyway, do so because of their sense of duty. Duty, not desire. Well, we need to find good guardians, and then the question becomes, does this nature, number one, does this nature even exist? Because there are certain problems right away, correct? We'll get to that in just a second. And if they do exist, how are we going to raise and educate them? We can't just expect them to be, right? How do we raise them? How do we raise our guardian children to become mature guardians as adults? How do we educate them? So the question of education comes in. Okay. Well, page 54. We realize that two qualities our guardians are going to need, they're going to require to be good guardians. Is they're going to have to be sharp-eyed and quick to see the truth of things. They're going to have a certain wisdom or a capacity for judgment, okay? They're going to have good judgment. I'm going to abbreviate here, but yeah, do you see that? They need good judgment. They're also going to need to be courageous, Socrates says, in the middle of page 54, right? They're going to have to be largely without fear, right? Strong presence of mind and fearless, right? They're also, we find out at the bottom of 54 into page 55, if they're going to guard our city, and we are the citizens, they're going to have a nature such that they are gentle to the citizens within the city, but fierce and savage to the enemies from outside the city, right? Right? So, have you noticed? Polemarchus's distinction between friend and enemy has come back, right? So let me take a quick note here. Okay. I do that from time to time. I like to take notes, too, when something hits me. Okay. Well, this is a strange sort of nature, right? It's kind of a paradox. Do you know this word? It seems to be a paradox. Perhaps even maybe a contradiction. A paradox, by definition, is when two things that are true seem to oppose one another, right? They seem to contradict one another, but upon examination you realize that they don't, that they can coexist. So here the paradox is we need guardians that are both gentle and savage. Gentle to citizens, but savage to enemies, right? That means they're going to have good judgment. How are we going to get them to have good judgment, right? Do we even know this kind of nature is possible? And Socrates, oddly enough, he comes up with a weird example that we do see in nature. Dogs. Of all things, dogs seem to possess this quality, right? Where they are friendly to those they are familiar with, and unfriendly, and they bark and growl and all of that, right, to those who are strangers, who they've never seen before, right? So we do find this kind of nature in nature, so it doesn't seem to be impossible, right? So, all right. Um, well, what are the two components for training our guardians, for educating them? Training, education, kind of synonyms here, okay? What are the two components of their education? Do you remember what Socrates says? He says it at the bottom of page 56. He talks about physical training and musical training. Physical and musical. Now that seems like an odd thing to say, doesn't it? Actually, physical training is what we call physical education, PE. We call that, that's what we actually use that term here in America. It's, exercise and training, maybe in some sports, right, to keep in shape and get good physical skills, dexterity, endurance, strength, speed, quickness, balance, all of those qualities, right? Yeah. Physical training. They need physical training. We want our guardians to be in shape. After all, one of their jobs, it seems to be, they're not only going to be ruling as government officials, but they'll also be policing and fighting. They'll be military, they'll be like military soldiers. They're going to do both. At least at this point, Socrates seems to suggest they're going to be doing both of those things. There's going to be a problem with that later on, but we'll come back to that, okay? All right. So we've got to train the soul physically and musically. And I think the reason why he says trains the soul physically is to really train hard physically requires a tough mind too, right? To overcome the pain that is involved, right? Well, the second thing is this thing called musical training. What's that about? Well, back then in the ancient world, music generally was part of storytelling. You told a story through a ballad or through music. Playing instruments, singing a ballad. You sung a story about the heroes, or you sung a story about the gods, or some other character of great importance. Does that make sense? That's how the ancient world worked. Music was part of storytelling. And if you realize, Socrates really then, once he mentions storytelling, he really focuses on that. We are going to be raising our guardian children on good stories. How do we do that? How do we do that? Do we want them to hear false stories or true stories? And Socrates has an interesting answer there, right? Because oftentimes parents will tell their children stories that aren't literally true, they're fiction, but they communicate an important truth, right? About character, or about being a good person, or about telling us something good about the world, so that we can better trust the world and trust in things and feel more confident as we live our lives, right? So true and false is an important value here. True and false, very important part of storytelling. That brings up the whole problem of this. This is very important. It's the question or problem of censorship. Censorship. Okay? Do you know what this word means in English? Socrates talks about how if we're going to raise proper guardians as children, we're going to have to supervise the storytellers. We can't just let storytellers tell any old story they feel like. They might tell a bad story that communicates something false or something bad that will harm our kids and lead them down a path that is not virtuous, not good, that will teach them the wrong things rather than the correct things, right? Well, to supervise the storytellers means we're going to engage in censorship, it sounds like. Isn't that interesting? That we're talking about that, even though we're trying to craft a city that is truly free, right? And not enslaved to those mad masters called the desires, right? Remember the mad masters from Cephalus way back in book 1? Desires are like a mad master whipping the self, making it obey. That doesn't seem like freedom, does it? Yeah. We don't want our guardians to be enslaved like that. But censorship, is that a good thing? That's not necessarily good either, or is it? Is it necessary? Yeah. Isn't it weird that in the city of necessity, certain things were not necessary, whereas in the city of desire, in this luxurious city, certain other things now are necessary, right? Very strange. Well, what kinds of stories does Socrates talk about initially here at the end of book 2? Stories about the gods. Stories about the gods, right? As you know, back then in ancient Greece, the Greeks worshipped a multitude of gods. Zeus, right? Poseidon, Hera, Aphrodite, and each of these gods they were the head of a certain area of life or domain, right? But as you may know too, the Greeks told all of these stories about how the gods were constantly fighting with one another. They're constantly trying to overcome the other god or goddess. Constant conflict. They're constantly trying to deceive one another. That's odd. Why would gods engage in deception and lying? Right? There are a lot of stories of the gods changing their form. Zeus one time took the form of a swan and raped an earth woman named Lydia as a result. He also took, he took the form of a bull, excuse me. And Zeus often took different forms, right? So that he could deceive some other god or some other human being, right? Is that something gods should be engaging in? It seems like in all of this discussion, Socrates is very critical of the stories that were popular with the Greeks at this time. Why is he doing that? Because Adeimantus talked about stories. Remember when he talked about the problem of justice? No wonder we're so unjust. The gods act unjustly. What are they doing? They're constantly fighting. They're constantly changing form. They engage in lying and deception. They send bad fates to good people. They are the cause of evil. If the gods are not just, why should I be just? Should we allow such stories in our city? Socrates seems to be saying no. No, no, no. We cannot allow such stories in our city. We cannot raise our guardians, if we want them to be just, on such stories. We can't let them, as kids, hear such stories and become attracted to such stories, right? And there are three values in particular Socrates wants to preserve in our storytelling. And here they are. This is very important. Number one, God or the gods, God never causes evil. He's never the cause of evil. Or the gods, you can put the gods in here too. The gods are never the cause of evil. If they are, then it's hard to see why we shouldn't be the cause of evil too, if it's in our interest to do so. See the point? Secondly, the second value is God never changes. God never changes. Do you see this? God never changes. And this makes sense once you really look at Socrates' logic here. You can only change in two ways, Socrates says, right? You can change from worse to better or from better to worse. Do either one of those changes make sense for a God who is supposed to be perfect and perfectly good? Do you see the point? Take the first one. From worse to better. Does it make sense for a God to improve and become better than the God already is? If a God needs to improve, then it seems like he or she cannot be a God. Then God cannot be God if God needs to improve. Does that make sense? Well, let's take the other one. Does it make sense for a God to go from better to worse? To take on a worser form and not stay and retain his better form, his perfect form? That doesn't make sense either. So Socrates concludes we cannot tell stories where the gods change from better to worse or worse to better. God never changes. That's another value we need to preserve. And finally, thirdly, God never lies. God never lies. God does not engage in deception. Even though, if you remember, and he talks about this a little bit at the end of book 2, we needed to lie to our crazy friend back when we were talking with Cephalus. Remember that? Remember our friend who wanted us to hold on to his weapons for him while he left? And then when he came back, he was angry. He was angry at someone, enraged, in a violent fit of temper, and he wanted his weapons back. Are we going to let such a person, such a friend, have his weapons back? No, because he's going to hurt himself and or others, right? And that doesn't seem like justice. Well, then that means we got to lie to him. I'm sorry, we don't have your. Let me find him. I can't seem to remember where I put him. Something like that. Can a lie like that be useful and good? That's a tough question, because lying normally is just bad, right? It's very harmful. And it's very bad to truly lie to ourselves. We do not want to be self-deceived, correct? So, these are the three values, right, that we want to preserve in our storytelling about the gods with respect to the education of our young guardians, so that they can become good and just guardians. Okay? I tell you what, we did that in just under 25 minutes. Very good. We are now done with book 2. Okay? And I think we're now really in the grip of thinking really deeply about the nature of justice and the problem of justice. It's not a simple question, is it? And here we are trying to build a city, right? And our city doesn't seem to be very just anymore because we allowed all these other desires in it. And now it's got a fever. But now we've got to try and find rulers who will help make the city just again. Correct? And so, as we end book 2 and we look forward to book 3, what we're going to see is we're going to talk some more about the stories we're going to tell our city. We're going to talk about how we will portray the afterlife, how we will portray heroes, how we will portray other important characters. We're going to talk about what kinds of music we should listen to. Because music seems to affect our souls, and so on. And so we need to grapple with the nature and culture of our city, okay? All right? 25, almost 26 minutes, very good. We are now caught up at this point, and sometime in the next few days, I will start making and posting the videos for book 3. Okay, but I need you to take on these assignments here, where you have a choice between writing one-page response papers. Okay, if you don't understand what I'm asking of you, please send me an email. Okay, thanks, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.